Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. I'm Jack Howell here. I'm here with my friend and colleague Mike Rusinek, principal clarinetist in the Pittsburgh Symphony. And I'm really glad to have a chance to sit down and talk with you.
Well, you know how long I've been wanting to do this.
Well, what's your favorite thing about me?
Top 5 in no particular order.
So there are some things, like I said earlier, that I've learned from you that I've found really, really valuable, and I've tried to pass on to students, and I'm hoping I can get your context. For instance, sprint to the finish.
Mm-hmm.
The source, and it's a great story if you're willing to tell it.
Yeah, I've told it a million times, and it's certainly one of my most humiliating experiences, but it was one of also the most instructive.
And it's gone right to the heart.
Yeah. So this is a true story. So I had just started. I just left school in Philly. I went to Curtis, and I had just started the National Symphony, and second clarinet in Boston Symphony opened up, and of course, studying in Philly, Harold Wright was our idol, and certainly I had come to appreciate his artistry and he was an example for so many things. And so the prospect of playing second to Harold Wright was just, it was too
intoxicating.
Yeah, of course. And so I thought I would take the audition, and so I played the audition, and then they had a super final round, and they brought there may have been 3, I can't remember, but I know that I was one of them, and Mr. Hudgens, who ended up getting the job and then eventually succeeding Harold Wright and becoming principal, we were invited back to play a super final round. We were told, okay, you're going to play in the wind section. The wind section will be assembled, and Seiji will conduct. And then they gave us a new list, and we had to come back about a week later. Maybe it was 2 weeks later. I can't remember. And so there were things like Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, and one of the things on the list was the opening of Bernstein Age of Anxiety Symphony. Now, have you ever played it?
Mm.
So I had never heard it at that point, and certainly so I get they give us the music, and for those of you who don't know it, it's really like a piano concerto, and the opening is 2 clarinets, very soft, very slow. So of course, what are they testing here? They're testing to see if you can play in tune and match Harold Wright's sound, and
on the page it looks dead easy.
Well, there's nothing to practice.
Yeah.
It's quarter notes and half notes, and it's slow. So I read through it, I listened to it, and it's like, okay, there's nothing to practice here. It's just a question of, can you play it in tune and match Harold Wright? And I thought this was going to be so great. And so I go to the audition, and I'm sitting there in my hotel room across from Symphony Hall, and I'm getting ready that morning, and I'm watching Little House on the Prairie. And I forget which episode, but I think Half Pint was up to something, and Pa was telling her what to do, and she was running around the field. And then I went to the audition, and I think we played some excerpt, and then Seiji said, take the Bernstein. So I put the Bernstein on my stand, and he says, you 2 play opening. I don't conduct opening. And of course, cold sweat forms because I have no clue how this piece goes. And so we start playing, and the parts don't move independently. I mean, they move independently. They don't move in tandem. So I don't know when I'm supposed to move and he's supposed to hold, or he's supposed to move and I'm supposed to hold. And we get about 2 bars in, and Seiji stops us and he says, that's not right. Start again. Okay, I have no idea what I've done wrong. And Harold Wright gives a downbeat. And so we start playing again, and we get to the same spot, and I haven't changed anything because I don't know what I've done wrong. And Seiji stops us again. And he says, "No, that's not right. Start again." So very quickly I say, "Okay, just a second." And I'm like, "Okay, how quick a study can I be?" So I look at my part, and I look over at Harold Wright's part, and I look at my part, look at Harold Wright's part. And then very quietly I kind of whisper to Harold Wright, I said, I'm sorry, I have it now. And to the whole wind section, he says, "He's sorry, everybody, he's got it now." And I just wanted to shrivel up and die. And he was my idol, you know, and it was just so humiliating. And, nothing against Mr. Hudgens. I'm sure there are many reasons why I didn't get that job, but that would have been a good enough reason. And so I learned at that, you should always try and take something away from every experience. And I certainly took away from that experience that, like, until you either have been offered the job or are dismissed, like, you can't stop preparing. Like, and I should have known that part cold. I mean, I should have known how each part moves. I should have known the whole symphony. And I didn't. It was just, they're going to ask me this, Seiji's going to conduct, it's going to be easy. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't prepared.
But it's the sprint to the finish part.
Sprint to the finish. So
it's a week away. You think you're ready. That's the most dangerous time.
No, you're not. You're not finished. I mean, even I would go so far after that experience that once I play around, while I'm waiting to hear whether or not I've advanced, I'm going to go and work on stuff. Yeah. And I'm going to work on stuff that I might have to play. Mm-hmm. I'm going to work on stuff that I've played. And I'm going to work on stuff that is not even on the list that might be asked.
You're going to stay in gear.
I'm just going to go until it's over.
Yeah. And it's a great lesson. And it certainly served me well, and I like to think it's maybe served some students well.
I hope students take that lesson from us instead of learning it the hard way, because it's pretty humiliating when it happens.
I can remember telling my daughter Karis, who's now in med school, fight for every point, sprint to the finish.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's another thing that you said that I've taken to heart, and it gets to the heart of a much larger musical question. And what you said is no unintended accents.
Yeah.
No unintended accents. And I think that's the dividing line between musicians who are devoted to discovering and illustrating the beauty that the music actually contains, and those who don't believe that they can't play it without putting their own special sauce on it.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to those, I think there's so much behind, like, no unintended accents. And sometimes when I'm talking to students or, people that I work with, I often ask them, like, so thinking way into the future, when the epitaph is written on your career, what do you want it to say? And you could say he had the fastest articulation, or for me it's that, like, I never made an accent that was unintended, and one thing that we were taught in school is the concept that, like, beauty of sound is almost 50% how you sound on any given note. Mm-hmm. But just as much contributing to that is how you go from note to note. Mm-hmm. And you can have the most beautiful tone, but if you don't have a beautiful legato, then the spell is broken. And when I was younger, we were taught that Mr. Delancey at school used to say that music is one note that swims. Mm-hmm. And it's not a series of notes. It's just one note that moves up and down. And so as a first year student in Philly, we spent the better part of the first semester just like on the first couple lines of Rose 40 number 1, just doing very slowly, just doing intervals and just trying to not perfect them. We weren't necessarily trying to perfect the intervals. What we were doing, I think, was we were trying to develop a sensibility. We were trying to develop a certain desire in the ear that we were going for. And then that concept eventually was taken to not just going from note to note, but like groups of notes. And where's phrase direction? And when you're playing a phrase, you can have the right destination and the right goal in mind, but just as when you're speaking a sentence, if you're placing the stress in the correct word, on the correct word in the sentence, if you place unintended stresses,
changes the meaning entirely.
It either changes the meaning or it obscures the meaning. And so that was a concept that we worked on as well. Was not just the concept of how you truly play a legato from note to note, but then how do you de-emphasize notes that tend to get emphasized in a line, such that your goal in the phrase can be preserved.
Yesterday I was watching an episode of Hot Ones, oddly enough, and a phrase came up that I thought kind of described this.
What is Hot Ones?
It's where they have to eat progressively hotter chicken wings.
Oh, okay. I thought it was something else. I had no idea what it was.
Yeah.
I thought, is this appropriate for a family show that you're running? But
the guest was the rapper Ludacris. And the phrase that he used is dynamic simplicity. And I thought that's something that really kind of, I thought that kind of fits. Making the expression, the thing I tell students is first give the music a chance to speak for itself.
Right.
Don't.
What a great concept.
Don't start hanging bells and tinsel on it. Give Mozart a chance.
It should, like great music kind of speaks for itself. Like we're just there to sort of uncover the truth in the text. Like that's what we're trying to do. Anything else, we're just putting our own, like, why not just improvise? Like, what do we need the composer for?
Yeah.
At that point, it just becomes an improvisatory exercise, which has value. I'm not saying that doesn't have value.
Where in your development of musical sensibility did that come? Did that come from Galper, or did that just come from your own feeling about it?
I think, it's hard to separate what comes from what because it all kind of infects your DNA. But certainly a lot of it came from Galper, right? I mean, Galper was one that used to tell me, not to mess around with things too much, like just play straight. Like one thing that drove Galper crazy and therefore drives me crazy is that this kind of disease of playing a phrase and then kind of hanging up on a penultimate note and elongating it for an expressive and I can't tell you how many times Galper would tell me, just go straight into it. Go straight into it. And we'd listen to these old, like the really old records, and whenever time was taken, it was always taken like at the beginning of a phrase, and then the end you always moved. Like if there was a run, if there was a lead-in of 7/16 notes into a theme, it didn't start quick and then slowed down into the theme. It took a little bit of time at the beginning and then moved. So you could always feel where your destination was. Like this is when we're going to land.
Right.
But in terms, so there was that kind of straight ahead, not overly, romanticized stylistic playing. But in school, I would say Mueller, our conductor at Curtis, was one that was, just very true to the composer and the style and the context, and it was all about the composer and not about us.
And your own individual secret sauce.
Right. It was not about that. He would say, if we were doing, he would say, Beethoven had more musicality and ability in the tip of his little finger than all of us, in the school orchestra put together.
Yeah.
So who do we think we are?
Yeah. This is going to be maybe a bit of a shift, but it's one of the things that I wanted to get, and one of the things that I learned, or one of the things that struck me when I first started playing with you, was the connection of sound to the silence on both ends of the phrase. And previously in my career, I had never been or played with a clarinetist who didn't have some sort of tone. It's kind of like when I hear the motorcycle, I'm thinking about a car. That with an automatic transmission, the motor kind of revs a little bit and then it goes. Or with a clutch, sometimes the clutch doesn't come out perfectly cleanly and there's a little bit of a jerk. But you have a way of playing that's like an electric vehicle, where the sound is not there and then the sound is there. And it's something that I'm still work on all the time and still don't feel that I've gotten anywhere close with. Can you kind of give us sort of a fantastic voyage style into the mechanics of starting the clarinet tone?
Well, yeah. So the concept for me, and I don't know to what degree it was explicitly stated, because it developed over so many years of instruction. So all I can do is tell you the way I kind of have synthesized it, and the way I conceive of it is that the concept must be, so when starting young players off from the beginning, it's the concept that the air makes the sound. End of story. The air makes the sound. The tongue doesn't do anything at the beginning of the sound. So I always ask young players, can you make a sound with the air and no tongue? Well, of course the answer is yes. Can you make a sound with the tongue and no air? And the answer, of course, is no. So the tongue doesn't do anything. Now, you can use the tongue and make a as hard a note beginning as you want, or make the tongue as audible as you want. But ideally, I don't want to. If I hear the tongue at the beginning of a note, it's too much.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is I'll break this down two ways. What I want to do is I want to make sure, from an articulation standpoint, that what the tongue does. And I don't know if this is answering your question, but I'll get around to your question. What the tongue does is it ends the vibration of the reed, and therefore the tongue creates a definition to the end of the note.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I've been using lately is I say, like, imagine, some people say, like, if I said to you, what syllable do you say, or what syllable would you say most students say for articulation?
Probably duh.
Yeah, they say da or ta or t, right? So for the sake of English words, let's take the word tea, because it's like the drink. You drink tea, right? So if you take the word tea 5 times, like we're singing 4 quarter notes and then a final note. T, 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 T.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I say, like, that's like kind of what most students say. T, 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 T.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say that, like, I don't care to what degree you're softening the T or you're using D or whatever syllable you want, there's a forward press of the tongue against the root.
Mm-hmm.
T, da, there's a forward press. Now, if you say T, 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 I say, okay, what if we took the first letter out of the word, of those 5 words, T, 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 and we put the T at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have, instead of T, 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 where you have a forward press of the tongue and then a decreasing of the air, we now say E, 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 E. Same letters, in the same order, except we're taking off the first one and just starting with the air, and we're ending with the first letter. Well, immediately, the quality of the T is completely different. There's no forward press. Eat, 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 eat. And the air doesn't diminish. So that's kind of the way I see the concept behind articulation, is that the tongue ends the note and the air never diminishes.
And that imposes a requirement that there be enough energy in the airstream to start the tone.
Exactly.
As opposed to having not enough and then damming it up with resistance and then letting the resistance go.
Right. Now, when it comes to starting, like if I'm starting whatever kind of...
Keep going. I'm just going to turn this down because the
sure.
shade.
Like if I'm thinking about starting a note with expression, whether that's the beginning of Sibelius 1, or the beginning of Rachmaninoff's 2nd, or just, take anything really soft, the beginning of the Weber Concertino, whatever that is. Rarely do I use the tongue, and generally I have enough pressure built up that I can start the note with the first molecule of air. So I'm not getting the air going fa. I'm just starting it as soon as the air starts.
So the pressure is, are you referring to energy of the airstream or referring to
Both.
restriction of the embouchure?
I'm referring to, it might be a restriction. Whether it's a restriction or some type of pressure or already a grip, I'm somehow gripping it such that I can control exactly when those vibrations are starting.
What I ask students to do is I ask them to play a long tone and find the middle of the note, and then take away the air, replace the air, so that they start the tone with exactly the same conditions that they had for making their most beautiful sound in the middle.
I like that. I think that's a similar concept.
Yeah?
Yeah. I like that. And often I use sort of like, it has to start right in the middle of the sound.
Yeah.
There's got, like, right in the core of the sound. There has to be that Montanaro used to describe like that feeling of like, a warm knife through butter consistency. Like, there's got to be that already you're feeling the core of it right from the start.
Now, is that something in your playing that you think came like it was baked in from the beginning, like with Galper's low register exercises, or is that something you had to learn?
Was it baked in from the beginning? No, it was definitely developed, but that was the first step for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that concept of very focused air, like thinking about, whatever, and what the reality is, I don't know, but making it feel like this is somehow as small as possible to make sure that the air is accelerating through I want to accelerate the air. Like whatever I'm doing, and I don't care how softly I'm playing, I don't know that, like, I don't know that students appreciate just how, like, forcefully I'm blowing. And so, you know, one of the things that the difference, I would say the main difference between Galper and Montanaro was that Galper came from the school that you play with, you know, as a young player, you play as strongly and forcefully as possible. And then as you develop your rich, centered sound, you whittle that down so that your soft sound is the same as your loud sound, just with the volume turned down. And Montanaro was exactly the opposite. You make a beautiful piano sound, and then you crank the volume up so that your loud sound is the same as your soft sound. But I don't think that works as well, because I think that assumes that you have a focused soft sound. And I don't think you can develop a focused soft sound unless you have a powerful loud sound.
And that kind of goes along with how great young athletes are taught. You know, tennis or golf. You know, they teach them to hit it hard.
Right.
You know, and then keep it in the court.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. I think that's exactly right. And I think that's a challenge when working with young players, is to sort of direct them where they're headed, but not expect them to be able to produce those kind of sounds right off the bat.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's okay to not be dialed in exactly right from the beginning. It's like, just blow. Blow. And so often, I'm sure you find the same thing. It's like, how often do you give a class and player after player comes up to play? How many of them are you saying, play less, play less? You're always saying, play more,
If
more
I
sound.
ever gave a class, I imagine that it would be like that.
No, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yes.
and everyone does the same thing. They play more, you say,
Yes.
do you think it sounded better?
Yeah.
Everybody says yes.
Yeah.
And then the next person goes up and there's no
Yeah.
sound. It's like, just play. You gotta play. You gotta play.
So, you know, speaking of young players, you've seen a lot of talented students come through at this point, and some of them have had success. Is there anything that you could point to that we wouldn't expect that is a common denominator in successful ones? I mean, you know, good tone, good rhythm, all that stuff. But is there anything that you've noticed?
Well, I don't know that it's unexpected, but it's the ones who are hungry for knowledge, like just that are hard workers. They're hard workers. They want to learn. They take responsibility on themselves, and you don't have to tell them, you should learn repertoire. And I'm not talking about solo repertoire. I'm talking about, like, listen to things, expose yourself to things. Go to concerts. Take it upon yourself to, like, be curious. And it's the ones that, like, are curious, I think, that combine, it's like Ron says, which I totally agree with. It's, you don't have to be the best. You have to be, like, good enough, and then combine that with hard work. And then I think I've seen a lot of, like, major talents come through who either, don't put in the hard work, or aren't curious and aren't interested, and they fizzle out.
Yeah.
And there are those that come through, and they might be late bloomers too, and all of a sudden it's like, but they want it. They're hungry for it. And I think the common denominator is people who want it.
Yeah.
You know? You have to want it.
And I think that's a great hope for late starters, or
Sure.
you know, and yeah. So one of the things that I read that I thought was really interesting was where you said that you went back to play for Galper after you were principal in the PSO.
Mm-hmm.
And he said you need to get back to basics.
He always said that. He always said that.
Yeah, he said no matter what?
No matter what.
Okay.
He always said.
So that wasn't like a particular occasion. Because my first question was like, well, what did that mean to you? What did you do? And yeah.
I mean, for him, it was always, everything was the basics. Everything was fundamentals. And even, shortly before he passed away, he was still practicing and he was still working on basics. And he still could make beautiful intervals.
Yeah.
And he worked on that stuff. And even whenever I would go back, I was 10 years old again. I was like in my first lesson. I remember one time I went and played, I think I was preparing to play Copeland Concerto here. And so I was up in Toronto, and I would bring my clarinet hoping that he wouldn't ask me to play. But,
Yeah.
and it was like, of course, 4 hours later, I'm still in the practice room. And he said, play this. And I'd play a little bit. And it was like back to Behrman scales.
Yeah.
And sixths in the back of the Behrman.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Kretsch and, doing all this kind of stuff. But he's right. I mean, because when you practice that stuff, you're practicing everything. So there was the fact that he stressed the fundamentals was, I think, in any discipline, if you want to maintain your skills for life, then that's what you do.
I think of Gretzky skating for 8 hours a day in his backyard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When he was,
You had an
5 in the morning.
unusual student-teacher relationship, like 3 lessons a week.
I did.
3-4 hours a lesson.
Yeah. Yeah, that was.
I marvel at that.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. When I started studying with Galper, he was already he had just retired, which meant that he had a lot of time. It also meant that I never heard him in the orchestra. But he had a lot of time, and he didn't want to teach me initially because I was basically a beginner. I was 10, but my mother's kind of strong-armed him into teaching me, and so I went and played for him, and he agreed to teach me, and there were sacrifices right from the beginning. Like you have to quit hockey. You have to, okay, so I did all that stuff, and then clearly our relationship was working, and then in high school, it just became, when I was able to take the bus and the subway by myself, I became independent of my parents driving me at 9 o'clock, for a 9 o'clock Sunday morning lesson, that I could, after school, go and take the bus and go to his house, and he wasn't, he was slowing down at the conservatory and at the university, so he had lots of time, and so like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'd go down and what was great about that, not just that I was getting so much time with him, was it wasn't about like preparing something and playing it. Like, I've prepared this piece, let me play it for you. It was, let's monitor how you are working on things. So there was time for me to practice for him, and he could monitor my practicing. And so often, you tell a student, work on this.
Yeah.
You have no idea what they're doing. And you assume they're doing it maybe the way you showed them a few times. But it's not always the case.
Yeah.
And so he could sit there and say, let's practice this.
And it's not necessarily because they aren't well intentioned, it's because of the power of habit. And when they're there and every single thing can be monitored, it's a different thing than when they're by themselves.
Of course.
Yeah.
And nowadays every student comes into a lesson and says, puts their phone down and says, "Can I record it?" And you've got your phone there and they're recording their lessons. We didn't have anything like that back then.
Yeah.
And so, it was with so much information being thrown at you, how much really are you going to retain?
But in some ways, it's kind of a throwback to centuries earlier, where if you had music lessons, that meant that you were probably a child of the court, and there was a music teacher in the full-time employ, and you might have a music lesson every day.
Right, or in the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that, right. I remember one time I was preparing for a competition, and how old was I? Maybe 17, and Galper was going to, it was before I went to Curtis, Galper was going to Israel, spending summer in Israel, and so I went with him.
Yeah.
And for one section, for a couple weeks I lived with his niece's family, and then we went to another place and I lived with his daughter, and Galper and his wife were there, and I just had lessons every day.
Yeah.
And I remember one time I think I was working on Busoni concertino or something, and it was late at night and I was practicing it and he was in the next room. And and I was just just hammering away at this passage, and just doing it over and over. And a knock comes at my door, and I open the door, and there's Galper in his pajamas, and he says, "Stop." He said, "It's not getting any better, and you're driving me nuts."
Yeah.
And that was the end of that day for me. So.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of things that I've taken from you that you took from Galper. Is there anything you can think of in particular that comes from Galper that is neglected in today's teaching?
One thing that Galper stressed was a real knowledge of many different fingerings.
Yeah.
And being adept at lots of different finger combinations, and a really concise way of notating fingerings, so that you can really become like efficient and quick. Whenever I have to learn a difficult passage, the first thing I do is I have my clarinet and a pencil, and I really come up with the most economical and efficient fingerings, and I'll write them down.
And here's another thing that you taught me, that the correct fingering for a passage is the one that produces for the audience the greatest impression of ease.
Well, absolutely.
And I'll tell you where I learned that, when we were playing Beethoven 4.
What did I do?
The trill fingering for the D flat. Or C sharp. And Bill would have skinned me alive.
Oh, he was a purist.
He was a Marcellus purist.
Right.
Like the F sharp is like this.
Right. No fake fingerings.
No fake fingerings.
Right.
But it sounded so good, and it immediately removed the difficulty of crossing the second register break.
Why would you want to do that?
And yes, and the audience doesn't know.
Right. Well, that's why I take the second movement of Shostakovich 9 on the B flat clarinet. I want to eliminate that A to F sharp interval. So now it's an A flat to F, and I've got a really easy fingering for the high F, and it can't miss, and so it's easy. But
that's a really valuable lesson.
For sure.
Yeah.
And so he stressed that. So I worked on a lot of mechanisms And he also worked on like a really efficient way of practicing technique using note groupings. A lot of people do rhythms, break things down in rhythms. And I mean, that's not what I do. I don't like rhythms because, like, if you play something in a dotted rhythm, whether it's dum ba dum ba dum or ba da ba da ba da, it seems like you're practicing some note being rushed.
Yeah.
And so I'm not a fan of that. Although, what I tell my older students is that if it's working for you, great. But if it's not, then I kind of use.
It's a field patch.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. So he was really good at coming up with I think an efficient way of practicing technique. Another thing that Galper did that I think not a lot of teachers did is that he created exercises, fundamental exercises that tackled many different issues at once. And so there were these really kind of seemingly simple exercises that worked on so many different things at the same time that for me it seemed like practicing that hour was the equivalent of practicing 3 or 4 hours because just everything was so dense in them. So I thought he was really good at that too. So yeah, I mean, now that we're talking, you say where do all these things come from? I would say certainly the way I think about clarinet playing comes from Galper for sure. It didn't. Those concepts didn't come from Montanaro. Montanaro gave a lot of other concepts, but not how to play the clarinet.
And I would imagine, just from, like, for instance, hearing his recording of the Brahms Quintet, that the logic in approaching a musical phrase as not just a bunch of notes and you can do whatever you want with it, but something that has a harmonic, that has an implied meaning that you can't just disregard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I would say looking at music that way, sort of decoding it and figuring out the underlying meaning, that whether it was because of my age or whether it was because of the instruction, I feel like that came from my time spent in Philadelphia. And the groundwork was laid when I was younger in Toronto, but that's not where I would pinpoint to my concept of like how I think about how phrases should go, or necessarily even my concept, I think of even of legato, I think came from there. So I certainly don't mean to minimize or give the impression that was not a valuable time. I think it was, equally important, which is saying something considering that it was many fewer years spent there.
Yeah.
So take that for what it is.
Speaking of years, going back, there's a picture that you have that is just, I saw it and it's immediately the picture of you and Bernstein.
Oh yeah.
That's such a great picture.
Yeah. That was.
Tell us about Bernstein.
Well, I mean, first of all, there is a photo from when I was a student in Tanglewood, but I mean, any time actually spent in his presence was spent kind of in awe, and so it's like, who the hell knows what was happening. But we did do that summer. We did Sibelius 2 with him,
Yeah.
which was just one of the great musical experiences. I mean, it was so over the top, and it was life changing.
Yeah.
It was just incredible.
So that's one of the things that those of us who never got to work with Bernstein depend on people like you to have some sort of idea for. Another thing that you're on a relatively short list of clarinet players who have had this is the experience of having a concerto commissioned for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's too simple a question to say what's that like, but what's that like? How do you know what's there's got to be a sense of responsibility to it. There's got to be some association
Well, there's
with
also
the composer.
it's terrifying because you don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
Right? Like, God forbid it's hard. You know, I don't want anything. I don't want anything hard. And there are a lot of new concertos that are really hard. and so that's frightening.
So the great guitar jazz virtuoso said, "Don't play anything hard. If it's hard, don't play it."
Right. That's the way I feel. And so the concerto that we commissioned.
So there's three of them now, right? You, the one with Nancy,
Right,
and
then the quad.
the concertante.
Right. So the one that was just for clarinet alone was by Alan Fletcher.
Yeah.
When he was the head of the School of Music here.
Yeah.
And of course we were at the time we were already close friends, and so he was a natural to ask because it's Pittsburgh connection and our friendship, and so when we got together, Alan, I don't know that he necessarily solicited my input, but I gave it anyway. And in an initial discussion, for some reason I said, if there was, I always wished that like Barber had written a concerto for clarinet. And so like, I wasn't, although he says that I kind of asked for the concerto that Barber never wrote, which I don't think I did. I was just like saying that that's where sort of my aesthetic sense lies. And so he ran with that idea, not to say that his concerto is Barber-esque, but I think it is very tuneful and very beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
I think the second movement, he knocked it out of the park. And so it was fun to see it come to life. Although it's at the beginning you don't know what you're going to get, and you hope that it gets some performances, and we've had some performances. So I feel very. I'd like to play it again. Actually, I think it's nice.
Well, here we go. We ask the internet.
Yeah. I'm available.
So it's always fun talking to you, and there's never enough time. The clock is ticking. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think I should have?
No, I think we've covered a lot of stuff. Is there anything that you?
No, I always think that as soon as I shut the camera, I'll always think, I should have asked that. And I always have the thought that the person I'm talking to maybe has the thought in the back of their head that, it would really be nice to talk about this. So, open-ended.
Let's save it for part 1.5.
Word.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, that was fun.